Hello and welcome to episode 51 of the Alfa Romeo Driver Podcast, brought to you by the Alfa Romeo Owners Club. I'm Guy Swarbrick, and this week's episode is a little bit different in two respects. First of all, we're talking about a car which, strictly speaking, isn't an Alfa, but it was inspired by one of the greatest Alfas of all time and has some Alfa DNA in its history. Second, the podcast is split into two parts. In part one, we're going to talk to Darren Collins of Dowsetts Classic Cars, who's responsible for engineering and developing the Tipo 184, inspired by the legendary Alfa Romeo Tipo 158 Grand Prix car. Then in part two, we sit down with TV's Anstead, who built the first two iterations of this car. So without any further ado, let's start at the beginning. Good afternoon, Darren.
Good afternoon, Guy.
A lot of people will have seen the car we're going to talk about, the Tipo 184, either at the NEC Classic Motor Show or on the stand at the Goodwood Revival.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, a lot's been made about the involvement of Anstead, and people will have seen Anstead Master Mechanic, but probably know less about you and your role in all of this. So tell us a little bit about your background and how you got involved with Ant and then how this project came about.
Oh my gosh, right, where do I start? I've been building cars for a long time, since before I was old enough to drive. I had a coach builder's apprenticeship, a YTS scheme. Then I joined the Armed Forces and was a chief engineer in the Royal Navy for 18 years. And I used to take cars to sea with me, or bits of them on the ships, and refurbish them while we were away. And I've always been building cars. Now, along the way, I always was interested in what was going on in kit car scenes and got to know Ant before the TV. And basically, we kept in touch and we ended up doing a build that some of you guys might know about, which was the first incarnation of the Alfa 158 homage, which was a challenge between Mike Brewer and Ant by Lancaster Insurance for the Classic Rumble. And then we did I helped a little bit on the Master Mechanic show and with the Haynes book. And during the production of the Master Mechanic, we had this idea, wouldn't it be great to make this car accessible to the masses, which is where the Tipo 184 project kind of began. But I've been working at Dowsetts, for many years, worked on For Love of Cars as well with Ant. So, done some crazy things, got some crazy things on the go. So watch this space, as they say.
I guess the important ththing, although we've had Mike on the podcast as well, so you're both friends of the podcast.
Yeah.
Who won that challenge?
Well, it was a charity challenge, and I think the answer to that is everybody won. Because Mike brought a lovely Escort convertible XR3i, and we had the first incarnation, and believe it or not, they went to auction at the NEC and both raised exactly the same amount of money. So it was...
what a remarkable coincidence.
Yeah, it was great.
And so thinking back to that challenge, why the 158 as the inspiration for that?
Oh, gosh. I think that was Ant's dream, really, the most iconic race car of the day, really, the car that started the Grand Prix, or the F1 as we know it today, and became very, very successful in the early days of the Grand Prix. You know, the Silverstone Grand Prix, for example, 1950, I believe, 13th of May. It just wiped the floor. And considering it was a vehicle that was manufactured or designed, shall I say, pre-war, to be around that long and still a great deal of time later have the supremacy in motorsport, you know, that kind of says it all for us and the project. So it really was, you know, that pinnacle, that iconic vehicle that was chosen for the Classic Rumble.
And if I remember correctly, and I'll get lots of emails if I don't, won 8 of the 9 rounds of the first Formula One World Championship, and only didn't win at Indianapolis because they didn't go.
Yeah, there was all sorts of funny things went on, and I think Fangio actually got kidnapped on one occasion as well. So, it was interesting times.
So we'll talk a little bit about the engineering behind them. What was underneath the original car, the challenge car?
The original car, that was a ladder chassis. That was a box steel frame ladder chassis. It had a Jaguar front suspension components. The rear axle on that was a offset differential that I think it originated in the TR7 of all things. So it was a right mix of things, and it actually had the MX-5 engine in, would you believe, that was put in at a slight angle in there as well. And that really was basically a created-as-you-go-along car. It was never intended to be road ready for the auction, and I think it would have done much better had it been a proper road-going car when it came to the auction. But nevertheless, it moved and drove. There's lots of pictures of it out there on the internet, and it was just a great-looking thing.
And how long was it between that and the Master Mechanic series?
Oh gosh, I think the Rumble, we were working on that about 2017-ish, 18. Don't quote me. It all merges into one now. It was probably a year or so later when the Master Mechanic series came about, and that was basically during a break of filming of Wheeler Dealers that they have every year. Mike goes away to do his own stuff, like the Trading Up series, and Ant was looking for something to do whilst Mike was doing his show. So that's how it sort of came about, really, as a show to fill that period of time.
And mechanically, that one was slightly different, wasn't it? It was the same fiberglass, or the same mould, not the same body, clearly, yeah. but a very different set of underpinnings.
Yeah, I mean, we actually used the same moulds that we made originally for the challenge car. You're absolutely correct, but it was entirely different. The base for it was an MG TD, and it had an Alfa Spider engine, and again a modified rear axle, but running the front suspension from the MG, and the rear suspension was a bit of a homemade affair using a lot of the parts that came off the donor Alfa. And
you mentioned the Haynes book, and the Haynes book has been on the stands alongside the Tipo 104, but it really it's more connected with the Master Mechanic car, or the concept of building your own special, isn't it?
It is, yeah. I mean, the Haynes book is really the book of the TV show, if you think of it like that, in respect to the three incarnations of this car. The book itself is it's a fitting end to what is the most amazing Haynes dynasty story. For those of you that don't know, John Haynes's very, very first book that he published was How to Build a Special, and Haynes recently sold out to Autofix to go digital. So there are going to be no more printed hard copy books. So the actual book of the show, the How to Build a Special, which is the Master Mechanic car, is the very, very last Haynes book to be published. So it's a lovely sort of bookends, really, of the How to Build a Special at the beginning and How to Build a Special at the end of the whole story. Which is just fantastic.
And I think, I don't know if there's a limited edition, but I know with my copy there was a repro of the original John Haynes book, which is quite fun.
Yes, yeah, we actually got Haynes to run a set of reprints of those, so that was great, and we do have some still knocking around, so they are available. It's not a plug, but
I would say the quality of the supporting artwork has improved over the years, but the spirit is remarkably similar.
Yeah, well, it's kind of funny, really, because we were actually making the show, and Ant asked me to do some little sketches, some measurements of when we were cutting the chassis, and I did some sort of, because one of my hobbies is art and watercolor painting and stuff like that, and I did some sketches for him, just rough sketches in my mind, and we were just looking at them over production because he wanted a record of some measurements, and he was like, wow, these are great, we should really incorporate this into the book. And then that's how the sort of the book itself, if you get a copy, the illustrations in the book are beautifully done. Now, what we did is we started off with some pencil sketches and sketches from Ant and everybody on the team, and then they were digitalized into a format by a friend, Paul, of ours, who's a brilliant CAD artist. So he made them, he tidied them all up. But there is still a pencil drawing of mine in that book, which is in the electrical section. But there's a few crept in there. But yeah, the illustrations and the history section of the book too was put together by John Lakey, a very well-known researcher in the automotive world, and he managed to get hold of some photographs that have never seen the light of day, and we got special permission to put them into the book to tell the story of the 158 at the beginning of that book too. So there's something in there for everybody.
And as we've said, the book isn't really related to the new car, but the new car came out of that process. So if the second generation car, the Master Mechanic car, was Ant's desire to redo the first one but do it properly, or to do it better than the first one. But that approach was never going to scale to build cars for a wider audience, was it?
No, exactly. And that's kind of how the Tipo 184 sort of began life, because we couldn't replicate the Master Mechanic car or expect people to do that at home, because, MGTDs have to die to make the Master Mechanic car. And there's only
and more importantly, Alfa Spiders have to die.
And Alfa Spiders have to die, and you'd burn in both hells of Spider and MG hell, wouldn't you? If you started killing all of those. So that's how we came about the idea of making it viable. Shall I say, for want of a better word?
And I think we had this conversation, I can't remember if it was at Goodwood or at the NEC, but I've had lots of people talk to me about the car. I mean, everybody who sees it is interested in it and how it came about. And it kind of falls into two camps. There's one camp amongst Alfa owners and enthusiasts. There's one camp that's somehow disappointed that it's not an Alfa underneath. Mm-hmm. And then the other camp, which I would say is a much bigger group, is the group that says, there are enough 105 Spiders and particularly 105 coupes that have already been lost or turned into GTA or GTA M replicas without butchering, classic Alfa to make a recreation of an Alfa Grand Prix Car. So I think most people on balance seem to be happy that whatever it is that's underneath, it's not an Alfa.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you can't please all the people all the time, and I think we had to make the decision. It was a dream that both Ant and I share of, handing down the dream and encouraging people to get involved in engineering and do something that they might not necessarily think they're capable of doing. So the whole ethos of the project was to keep it simple and make it easy to assemble, so you don't have to be an engineer to put it together. And going back to the accessible side of things, back in the time we were looking at what we were going to use as a donor, people were giving away the MX-5s when they were failing the MOT. We had people literally handing over a couple of cars that was almost worthless. Now, like everything, they're going up in price, and the donors are sort of between £500 and £1,000 now. But equally, if you were looking at using an Alfa-based donor, you'd be looking at far more than that anyway.
Yeah. And I think you said there about people who don't have much experience in engineering. The other thing that it strikes me, and we'll talk a bit about the cost of it at the moment, is it's kind of well within the realms of a sixth form college or even a school doing a bit of fundraising and getting together the budget to have a bunch of students build one of these.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we want to encourage that. It'd be great if students could build these cars, going back to the day when most of the technical colleges used to have, manufacturers like Triumph and others used to provide chassis for the kids coming through the colleges to work on. It'd be great if we could do that sort of thing, and then there's a bit of competition between the colleges because they can race the car afterwards. So there's that competition element. But yeah, I mean, anything to encourage the kids. And one of the most amazing twists in the story of Tipo is that we've been working with universities in Hungary, believe it or not. Really strange pairing with, it's just one of those opportune things that happened. And I've had teams in the Hungarian universities sitting in front of computer screens that want to be future automotive engineers that want to be NCAP test engineers, modeling my chassis design in every combination of crash test, twist, torsional strength, and all those things that you need to learn to be an NCAP test engineer, using the Tipo as a basis. So the amount of data we've got from there on the chassis and improving the product is, it's priceless.
Priceless, but the alternative would have a price on it. I guess that's what, tens or even hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of research effort.
Yeah, exactly. And the guys over there, there's a wonderful proving ground over there. There's actually a Tipo over there up and running at the moment. We've got Tipos being delivered to customers in Europe. We've actually got, would you believe, as we speak, we've got a lorry. We've got another 4 kits going out this weekend to customers. So yeah, it's really exciting times.
So assuming I'm not a sixth form college and I don't have a fully equipped workshop and stuff, I'm going to do this out of my garage.
Mm-hmm.
Apart from a decent set of sockets and spanners, what am I going to need to actually put one of these together?
Really not a lot, to be honest. I mean, the biggest thing, if you've not got a load of mates, is getting the engine in. So you can normally hire an engine hoist for a day. That is really the only specialist equipment you need. And to prove that, what I purposely did, we've got a YouTube channel, tipo184.com, which has got the assembly guide on for the car. And I thought, I'm not going to build it in the workshop, because in the workshop, we're fortunate, we've got ramps and all sorts of fancy tools. I'm going to build it in what we call the showroom, which is just a plain room with a concrete floor. So all you need is a couple of axle stands and a socket set and some screwdrivers. And you can see that in the video. There are no specialist tools involved, other than, I said earlier, an engine hoist. So you don't need, to feel as if you've got to have some fancy workshop. That's the whole idea behind the project and the way that it's been engineered.
And there is one other thing you need, obviously, which is a credit card or. So what's you talked about the cost of the donor car?
Yeah.
What else? There's a range of options. What's the kind of sliding scale of how much you need to spend and how much you can spend on a 184? When
it comes to need to spend, I mean, what we do is we break it in easily to you. What we do is we sell a starter kit, which is normally about £10,000. To be fair, that includes everything you need, pretty much, to get yourself a rolling vehicle with a body shell and all the other bits and bobs. So then onwards, there are lots of other little kits which are all available on our website. They make up all the other parts of the car. So you'll have things like a cooling kit, which will have your radiator and your hoses in. You'll have a fuel delivery kit, which will have a fuel cell, fuel pump on the hoses, mirror signal maneuver kit, which is exactly what it says. It's a steering wheel, fancy steering wheel, and some mirrors and various other little bits. So to answer your second part of the question, you can spend as much money as you would like on the car, but to buy everything from us is about £20,000, give or take. But I would imagine, people will build their car on a budget. Some will build it under that. Somebody might want to do an absolutely millimetre perfect, accurate replica of Fangio's 158 in a particular race and wire lock every nut and bolt beautifully. And I encourage both of those ideas. So, if somebody wants to run it round on their old little MX-5 wheels while they're saving up for their wires, all them sort of things, it's great. I mean, I'm not going to tell you what to do. I just want to see the creativity.
Yeah. And I guess the other thing that lots of people have asked me about and we've chatted about is the uses for the car. So, I mean, you look at an open wheel car and your immediate assumption is that it's a track day toy.
Mm-hmm.
But there's, at least in theory, there's 2 other directions you can take it rather than just something for you to play around in on an open track day, aren't there?
Oh, certainly, yeah. I mean, in fact, December last year, I got our Tipo through the IVA test. So our vehicle is now fully road legal. And to achieve that, we have to produce a mug-on and a light kit for the car. Now, as you say, there's lots of different routes you can take with this car. You can use the car 24/7, 365 days of the year if you keep those mud guards and the lights on the car. But equally, you can remove those items, but it will limit you to daylight running, and you're not allowed to throw any spray up if you don't have mud guards. So as long as you're using hand signals and you want to look like Fangio, you can use the car on the road. But if you want to be slightly more practical with it, you can keep the lights on, or you can have a combination of both. You can drive it to the racetrack and within half an hour, take the wings off. There's only 2 bolts on the front, 3 on the back, and go racing.
And the idea of driving it to the track is fantastic. You say you can drive it 24/7. There's a couple of slight practical limitations. You'd have to drive to places that weren't very far away, and if you drove to your local Sainsbury's, you wouldn't be able to bring much back with you.
No, I mean there is kind of that. I mean, having said that, we've got a 5-gallon fuel cell, a racing fuel cell that comes with a kit. So the car's a little bit, well, I say it's 2/3 the weight of the donor, and a donor MX-5 is easily going to achieve 30 miles to the gallon. So you've got 150 mile an hour range, which in today's world where everybody's getting range anxiety with EVs, I think once you've been in a Tipo for 150 miles, you want to rest anyway. So
well, yeah, and I guess if you drive it to a Sainsbury's with a fuel station, you can drive to 150 miles away and then drive home again.
Ideal, and just I don't know, buy a packet of crisps or something, it'd be perfect, wouldn't it?
But you talk about driving it to a track and racing. So the other aspect of this, you talked about the road approval, but it was also designed not just with kind of fun track day use in mind, but as a proper racing car.
Yeah, I mean, right from the onset, when we looked at this concept, we wanted to have the ability to use the car on the track. So what that meant is, whilst I was sitting, scratching my head, holding bits of tube, thinking, how am I going to glue all of this together? We had some very nice people come down who were representatives from sort of the MSA, the Blue Book people, scrutineers. And obviously we got copies of the up-to-date regulations, the Blue Book -FIA regulations, which tell you the thicknesses of the tube, the radiuses of the bends and the roll cage and seatbelt mountings, all those sort of things that I engineered into the car from the very, very beginning. Now, I've been building kit cars for a long, long while. I've worked on all sorts of cars. So I engineered in what I best thought was crash protection in various geometrical ways into the vehicle to add into additional strength. And combining that with those crash test simulations that we've done and the torsional twist simulations, I'm just absolutely blown away that it performed exactly how I envisioned it to perform. So whilst motorsport, and there's always a disclaimer, it's a dangerous sport, what we've done is we've engineered this car to be as safe as we possibly can, or being as conscientious as we can in the design from day one. So that gives us a bit of peace of mind when we've got these people turning up at the circuit wanting to race. And
at the moment, I know what my biggest disappointment with the car so far is we came along to see it and I couldn't fit. So our club manager Nick Wright was lucky enough to have the test drive, although as people will find out from the article, he didn't get to go very far. Is that something that will be remedied in the production vehicle? Will tall fat people be able to buy one as well?
Well, you see, I'm the benefit of being the same size as Fangio. I'm a little person, and when this whole project began at the beginning, the body shell we actually used for the challenge car and the body shell we used for Master Mechanic, we pretty much dimensionally made those two incarnations of the cars to be a reasonable representation of the 158. Now that gives you quite a small cockpit because Fangio. Yeah. When you look at the drivers in those cars, they were bolt upright. Most of the driver was almost out of the car effectively, so there wasn't much room. And those drivers back in the day were a lot shorter. So we realised this from from day one. Now, we got so far into the project and I was locked into design the chassis and the running gear to fit within the body. So I had those constraints from day one. But it became quite apparent that, normal sized people, shall I say, because I'm only little, it's a bit of a squeeze.
I'm waiting for you to tell me I'm going to have 3 inches taken out of my legs.
No, not at all. Not at all. What we've done is all the production cars, it's only the one car, the prototype car, that has the chassis the size it does. Every single Tipo from now on, including the ones that have already been delivered to the customers and the ones that are on the way, have got an additional 200 millimetres, 8 inches in the cockpit area to take into consideration a driver with a helmet up to 6'3" in height. We've obviously sold a lot of cars or got orders coming in from America. So our next biggest challenge is the width of the seat, believe it or not. So there's always something to catch you.
I guess you have the advantage that the track of the MX-5 subframe is probably slightly wider than the original Grand Prix car was. So you've got a little bit of space to play with.
Yeah, there's a little bit of leeway there. I think from day one, we wanted to make this accessible. So taking the Mazda subframe, the rear subframe, which has a centre-mounted differential, and offsetting it to give you some more cabin space was going to be cost prohibitive. So what that actually did is it did put a little bit of constraint into the height that the driver sits. But again, with the increase of the length of the chassis, that's now no longer a problem.
Has that affected the gear change routing, or is that still
not at all.
Beautifully engineered but slightly odd-looking?
Odd. That's an unusual word, but beautiful looking design.
No, from an engineering perspective, but it's not where you expect it to go.
No, I mean, again, when I fortunately, geographically, I live very close to Jim Stokes' workshops, and being a car guy, I've known Jim for donkey's years, 20 plus years, and I've been loitering with intent in his workshops every time he's had that 158, the one they built there, and he's had it back most recently. So, I've crawled all over and inside out and upside down of a real 158, and the gear lever on the 158 is not the most ergonomically placed, and I think we'll leave it there.
Okay.
And we had to come up with another solution using the Mazda. So again, I just looked back at history and looked at a lot of single-seaters, things like Coopers and cars of that ilk, and they had some sort of really interesting but clunky-looking gear change mechanisms. So what I did is I kind of looked at the basics of how they worked and tried to make it aesthetically pleasing, and that's what we have. So to answer your question in a eventually, the gear change is unaffected because where the stretch in the chassis is actually behind where the mechanism sits, so that remains unchanged. It's exactly the same.
For those of you who haven't seen the gear change, there's some pictures of it in the article, and it is a work of art. It just where it's positioned to be kind of convenient for the driver and somewhat authentic in terms of where the gear change is requires an interesting routing because of where the MX-5 running gear is.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a lovely piece of work. Actually, on the subject of beautiful engineering and the potential American market, I saw on Twitter the other day you've been coming up with some other interesting accessories that Fangio would possibly have been surprised by. I don't think he had a cup holder in his 1950 Tipo 158.
You know what? That was so much fun to put a cup holder in there because. Cars these days, this new generation, and particularly if we're aiming it at kids and whatever, they judge cars by cup holders and Bluetooth connectivity and all that nonsense. So we had this idea and always wanted to take one through a drive-through. And I thought, I didn't even tell Anne, I thought I'm going to make a cup holder, but I'm going to make the most period racing 1930s aluminium aircraft looking cup holder that you possibly could and stick it in there. So it's a lot of fun, and I actually templated that last week as well, so we can laser cut those now. And if anybody wishes to have a cup holder in their Tipo, they are going to be available.
So you said you've just shipped 4 out, so sales are obviously going reasonably well.
Mm-hmm.
If I decided I wanted one tomorrow, and don't expect me to phone up with a card number tomorrow, but if I did, how long would I have to wait for a kit at the moment?
Currently, you probably wait about 3 months. Now, we did launch quite a while ago, and we're fulfilling those orders now. Because of the COVID scenario, it's been absolute nightmare for everybody, to be fair. And, just shortages in materials, difficulties with transportation, various other things. I'm not going to go into it. We all know the situation of the world. So those orders that we took from launch, we're now fulfilling those. So roughly by Easter, the new orders that are placed now should start to be fulfilled.
Okay. And we talked about it being engineered for racing. And I know you've been talking to the BRSCC about a racing series. Has that got any further, or is that still something once you've got a base of customers out there to revisit?
I think the difficulty we have with starting a race series is it's always a bit chicken and egg. Because to get a race series, you need a certain number of finished vehicles to actually establish and start the race series. So what the BRSCC have said to us, and very, very kindly, they've offered track time to anybody building a car that wants to get out and about on the track on their practice and test days. And then when we've got a sufficient number of cars and a sufficient number of people that want to race, then we can start our own race series. So again, it was only last week, working with the BRSCC, we're looking at writing those specifications because that day is getting nearer and nearer. So I need to get those specifications finalised so that those serious builders now that purely want to race, know what they need to do to comply with the new rules.
So again, if I phoned up tomorrow and ordered 20, then everything's in place to get a series up and running.
Yeah, you might. Please phone up tomorrow and order 20. That would be great. So everything is in place, and we're already working with, because part of Dowsetts and myself, you may have heard of the Association of Heritage Engineers. So we're all dealing with engine builders and people, particularly for the race series, because at Dowsetts we effectively we build dreams. We're building all sorts of weird and wonderful vehicles. We are not engine rebuilders per se. So we're speaking with guys that supply all the catering boys for their race series, that build their engines, and people that race in the MX-5 categories, various other things. So
there are literally, we know the Alfa Romeo Championship used to be run by BRSCC. It's with the 750 Motor Club now, but a lot of the BRSCC meetings, there were 150, 200 MX-5s there racing. So there's a lot of MX-5 engine tuning experience out there, isn't there?
Oh, there is quite. I mean, and the thing with the MX-5 is there's such a great community. There's a lot of aftermarket support. I'm going to say the cars are plentiful. They still are plentiful. We've already had people that race in that community interested and looking at the 184 as another sort of option, because it's their familiarity, because of the drivetrain and everything is 100% MX-5. Then it's in their comfort zone for them. But the aesthetic of the car and the way that it's handled and designed with the changes to the suspension and the period wheels and everything else, it is something that they want to have a go with, because they think it's going to be more engaging.
And obviously it was designed around a particular MX-5 version. If those get to be a little bit thin on the ground, how much effort does it take to move it to a newer version of the running gear? Well,
the car is designed primarily around the Mark II MX-5, which is 1998 to 2001. And the reason behind that, or thinking behind doing that, is that they were the cars that appear to suffer the most with corrosion on the sills, the front parts of the chassis, not the parts we use, but actually the body shell and the wheel arches, all those sort of things. And they made quite a lot of them. Now, the Mark 2.5, which came obviously after the 2, there's very subtle differences they're not unsurmountable. There's some crazy differences. As an engineer, when you look at it, you think, why on earth would you do that? Because that must have cost you a fortune. Silly little things like the steering universal joint is about 10 millimeters longer in the Mark 2.5 than the Mark II. And obviously it's a tight squeeze in our chassis just because it's 10 mil longer. And you think, what financially made you make that decision? But nevertheless, there's lots of silly little things like that. Now, I have built a prototype Tipo using a lot of 2.5 parts. So it's not the end of the world when we run out of Mark IIs. But, they made thousands of them. So it's going to be a long while yet. And there's still a lot of Mark 2.5s around. And I think 2030 is going to be more of an issue than running out of Mark II donors, to be honest. And even then, we've got a solution for that too.
And I think the last thing I was going to talk to you about, and it's probably, given the link to the Tipo 184 is the 158 inspiration, it's probably the most tangential question. But I know when we spoke before, you said that there's also the possibility and the aspiration to have multiple bodies. So maybe have a Maserati 250F or a Lancia D50 body on the same running gear. Has that idea progressed, or are you happy to be fulfilling Alfa bodied ones for now?
I'm sworn to secrecy, but I cannot confirm or deny that I'm already working on those drawings and they're being digitalised at the moment, allegedly. So there are lots of exciting things to come. So we are working on different body styles to fit onto the existing Tipo. So again, that affordability. Once you've got your Tipo, you will have the choice then, or you can, to have either or a multiple array of bodies that you can swap and change onto your chassis.
And I assume your Hungarian colleagues have ruled out if you do a Lancia D50 using the side pontoons as additional fuel tanks as they did in period.
Yeah, I don't think that would go down too well with the NCAP test regulations.
No. Probably even if it was a compliant fuel cell, it's probably not the place you'd want to mount it, is it? No,
not only that, and having just put, doing that thing that everybody said was impossible, which was getting an Alfa 158-esque homage, whatever you want to call it, through an IVA test in 2021. Now we're into 2022. There's no mean feat, I tell you. So we don't want fuel tanks anywhere they shouldn't be, thank you.
The other comment that I had, which was an interesting one, was after we ran a couple of articles, one about the Goodwood revival in the December issue, and one about a little bit more detailed about the Jim Stokes 158 that you talked about earlier. And the interesting thing about that 158 is that it is a 158 in every respect, built from 158 parts from the basement in Portello. But that was never a car in period. That was a collection of parts. Mm-hmm. So it's not quite in the same sense that the Tipo 184 is a homage. It's also not quite a 158, despite having a genuine engine and an Alfa running gear. It still isn't really a 158.
No, I mean it's like the old story about Bugatti Type 57s, isn't it? Where they say, out of the 762 built, there's 850 of them still on the roads.
Well, we had Jim on the podcast back end of last year, and I can't remember the numbers, but he was saying there are more Jim Stokes, I can't remember 6C or 8C engines, or one or the other, out there than there were factory built cars.
Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it? But I think as long as we're still able to do these things, I don't think anybody should necessarily, say no more, No,
and, there are definitely going to be purists in the club and people fortunate enough to be able to own real 158s among them who'll look at this and say, no, it's not for me. But I think for a lot of us who were inspired by Fangio and the car, the idea of having something that, whether we buy them or whether we just appreciate the fact that the mark and that racing heritage is being taken out to a much wider audience through the Tipo 184 is a good thing.
Oh, definitely. And long may it continue. And the way I look at it is if it makes you feel good as an individual owning and driving your car, then that's all that matters.
Yeah. One of our club members, again, a recent podcast guest, is a hill climb driver in an Alfa 156 GTA with a 3.8 litre engine. And he's trying to persuade me to go hill climbing in a road car. And I must admit, I haven't had the conversation with my wife yet. But I do quite like the idea of going up Chelsea Walsh in something that looks like a 158. I'm never going to be able to afford to do it in a real one. So I think even if the BRSCC series, takes a longer time to get enough cars out there, it'd be nice to see some in sprints and hill climbs over the next year or so.
Yeah, definitely. And that's our intention really, is to encourage people to get out and about in their cars and to use them and do some amazing things and just have some amazing experiences.
Brilliant. Well, I think that's probably all we've got time for. So thank you very much for that. It's been fascinating, and I look forward to getting the article done and out there as well.
No, it's been an absolute pleasure, Guy. Thank you very much indeed.
A couple of weeks after we spoke to Darren, we managed to snatch a few minutes with Ant to get his perspective on the project. Sadly, for the first time since episode 2 of this podcast, we had a few technical problems, which led to the second half of the recording becoming corrupted. But more of that later.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me. I've just landed in England, so you're going to get a jet-lag podcast. So if I say anything rude or slurry, blame it on British Airways.
So we're at an event at Dowsetts Classic Cars. We've had Mike Brewer amongst other people here. So just to give you a bit of a challenge, this will be our 51st podcast. Mike did podcast number 9 for us.
Oh my gosh!
And Mike is currently our most popular podcast.
Wait a second, I'm not going to be beat by Mike Brewer.
So that's your challenge.
Wow! So you've had 44 chances to outstrip Mike, and you failed. Okay, we're going to do it with this one. So if we say something controversial or rude, it'll get in the press, and then the press will then drive the audience, and everybody wins. So
we've just finished talking to Darren about the whole process. But where did the idea come from to do a Tipo 158? What was the inspiration?
I mean, it actually started out in California. Wheeler dealers for a season boils down to 9 months. What that means is 3 months of the year is off, and most people would take the holiday. But I work in an industry that's freelance, so the worry was that we had all this great crew on Wheeler dealers, and we were going to lose them because, of course, they don't want to not work for 12 weeks. They were going to go on to other shows. So I kind of hatched up this plan. How do we keep all the Wheeler dealer freelancers, the directors, the camera, the sound, the producers working so we don't lose them, and make use of the Wheeler dealer workshop? And at the same time, that coincided with me having this hankering for building myself a special, because by then I had established myself in the US. I'm always building stuff. I hadn't just finished my Mustang, and I started to get itchy feet. So I set about to build a special. So I said to the network, look, I'm going to build this special anyway. We've got a 12-week window. Why don't we film it, not lose the crew, make use of the workshop space, otherwise it's going to sit empty. And that's exactly what we did. And what I really love about that show, it's called Master Mechanic, is it's a genuine start to finish, real-time build in 12 weeks. And it is incredibly real. We break the fourth wall. We talk to the crew. I shoot some of it myself. I shoot some on my phone. In fact, I got injured quite badly in the middle of it. I had to have an operation. So it really was, a warts and all reveal of, this crazy idea and struggling and muddling through to build a car from scratch. So that was the genesis.
So do you still play football during the filming?
I do. In fact, I sit here in this podcast with a battered ankle because I was tackled. Yeah, I'm still managing to, at almost 43 years old, I'm still managing to hold my own in this SoCal Premier League. I'm clinging on like, no, I can still make it.
But it was the second attempt at the 158, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, originally we'd come up with this idea of having a charity build-off at the NEC between Mike and me. And, it was a bit of a competition thing because ultimately we were both given a small bit of a budget to go out, get a car, restore it, and then auction it for charity. And then ultimately whoever's car auctioned for the most won. And ironically, we both auctioned for the same amount, which is annoying because I really wanted to beat him. But
you scratch built a Grand Prix car and he tarted up an XR3.
No, he did a beautiful job on an XR3. Yeah, he did restore an XR3. It was beautifully done. And myself and the team here at Dowsetts, we set about building a scratch built car. So originally back then, while I was mulling over what was the best car to do, I'm experienced enough to realize that we only had a small budget, and the expensive parts of cars are things like chrome and glass. The tricky parts are doors and latches and locks. And all of a sudden I'm thinking, wow. And I love 1930s Grand Prix cars. And I'm thinking, well, there's no glass, no doors, no chrome. There's nothing shiny. The engineering's relatively basic and agricultural, I know. Let's pick, in my opinion, the best, 1930s Grand Prix car. And then ultimately that led us down the path to narrow down to the 158 because it was the first car to win a Formula One race. So it was historic. So I got to have a bit of a teaser on the charity build off. Because of that build, we created molds, and then those molds gathered dust. So, wind the clock forward to that 12 weeks off in the middle of Wheeler Dealers. I was just going to build a special anyway. I fell in love with the car we did for the charity build, and the molds were there. And I just said to Discovery, hey, come and build this. And it's weird as well because at the same time, Haynes were very secretly, moving away from print. And the first ever Haynes manual by John Haynes back in the day was how to build a special. And it was kind of serendipitous that I was building a special. So it kind of had this really lovely timing about it. The fact that we had this time off, I wanted to do it. The molds were ready. Haynes were happy to document it into the last ever printed Haynes book. And that's how the one on the show got made. But what was really interesting about the show car is if you've watched the show, and if you haven't, shame on you first, but you should. It's called Master Mechanic, and it's really real. But the build was actually quite advanced. It had an offset rear axle, which required a lot of machining. The engine was angled. Everything about that car was bespoke. The donor I used was an Alfa Spider, and there's not that many of them. So when you consider people would watch the show, and hopefully the point of us doing this is that they're then inspired and they want to go and have a go and get their hands dirty. But it was pretty obvious that at the end of that build, it would take an advanced home engineer to repeat the car. The offset rear axle on its own is an advanced bit of engineering, and it required machining and new drive shafts and hardening and splined ends, and it kind of goes well beyond the average mechanic. And I was kind of scratching my head because it was quite obvious from social media and from feedback from the show that people were inspired by the build. They liked the show, and we're now entering a time when COVID is starting to hit, and I think people's mindsets changed. There was more value in doing stuff at home or doing stuff with family. People weren't allowed to travel, so they were already turning their attention to the garage. So I sort of sat with the team at Dowsetts and with Darren in particular and said, gosh, we've got the molds, and, we have the Haynes book, and the show's a real, inspirational bit of content. Let's do it, but let's not use a Spider. Let's not offset the axle. So we sat about sort of thinking, well, what is the best donor? And we narrowed it down to the Mazda. When you consider, I think, and we chose the Mark II deliberately because the Mark I is, let's be honest, a modern day classic. Yeah. We don't want many people scrapping Mark Is, but the Mark II, still a great car. The stats were overwhelmingly in our favor. 2,000 Mark IIs are taken off the road each year for MOT failure. From a drive and engineering perspective, they're pretty solid, but from a body perspective, the weakness is the rust. So if we could create a kit that people at home could have a go and build their own 158, and it discounted the tricky Mazda bits, the rusty parts, but made use of the rest, you'd actually end up with a really cool car. Because it has the magical ingredients: manual, rear-wheel drive, 5-speed, twin-cam engine. It was just ready. Rack and pinion steering, disc brakes. So we just set about doing it. We went and got a Mazda, stripped it down, and started to engineer. And I got to take my hat off to Darren. He was such a big influence in that build. He really, really took it by the horns, and he engineered a fantastic car. And if you actually compare the Master Mechanic one on the show to the one that we've made with the Mazda, although on the face of it they look similar, they are incredibly different. The Mazda one's wider, it's taller because we wanted to incorporate a roll bar. Because one other thing we wanted to do was add a one-make race series. So the car needed to pass MSA standards. It needed a particular roll cage. So we ended up just going on this really cool creative journey where using a Mazda and as little parts as possible.
And that's where it all went wrong. The remainder of the conversation's worth mentioning, though. The next subject we talked about was the challenge the Dowsetts team has set themselves and Ant to demonstrate how easy the car is to build. They're going to build one live over the 3 days of the Practical Classics Classic Car and Restoration Show at the NEC from the 18th to the 20th of March. The team estimates the total construction time for a car at 100 to 150 hours, but that includes harvesting the parts from the donor car, which will have been done prior to the event, but it's still a fair chunk of work to do in just over 24 hours. We'll be there to see how they get on. Ant also talked about his new venture with Dodge in the US, the Radford Racing School in Arizona, which is built around Dodge's SRT cars and trucks, but thanks to Dodge's links to Alfa Romeo through the Stellantis group, also features a number of Stelvio Quadrifolios and a 4C if you happen to be in the area. That's it for this episode, and as usual, we'll be back in 2 weeks' time on Sunday the 27th of February to talk about the new Alfa Romeo Tonale, which by then will have seen in the metal for the first time at Alfa Romeo's new UK headquarters in Coventry. Episode 52 will be available to download from 1:30 p.m. from the club's website and YouTube channel, from Podbean, Podcast Addict, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and everywhere else good podcasts are found. Until then, stay safe.